Welcome to Horns of a Dilemma, the podcast of the Texas National Security Review, TNSR. I'm Doyle Hodges, Executive Editor of TNSR. In this episode of Horns, we listen to a discussion between Will Inboden, Executive Director of the Clements Center on History, Statecraft, and Diplomacy at the University of Texas, Austin, and Dr. Jim Golby, a Senior Fellow at the Center. Jim and Will are discussing the potential similarities and differences between foreign policy in a potential second Trump administration or a Biden administration. Both Jim and Will bring to this discussion a wealth of policy experience. Will served in the presidency of George W. Bush, and Jim served as a senior advisor to both Vice President Biden and Vice President Mike Pence, having seen the decision-making processes in the two administrations close up. Their conversation is wide-ranging, covering a variety of foreign policy topics, as well as discovering differences in process, personality, and procedures that might characterize differences between the two potential administrations. Let's listen in.
Welcome to the latest installment in our Clements Center weekly webinar speaker series. I am Will Inboden, Executive Director of the Clements Center, joined by my colleague and friend, Dr. Jim Golby, Senior Fellow with the Clements Center. And we're doing a couple things a little bit different this week. As most of our audience knows, usually we're bringing in outside guest speakers, of whom we're blessed to have an abundance of experts in our network. Today, we thought might be a chance for you to hear from some of our homegrown folks here, particularly me and Jim, locals with the Clements Center. And to set the stage for our discussion today, those of you who have been viewed our last couple speakers know that 2 weeks ago, our webinar featured Rebecca Heinrichs of the Hudson Institute, who in her overall remarks made clear that she was generally pretty supportive of President Trump and the Trump administration policy. Last week, we heard from Dr. Evelyn Farkas, who, in addition to her overall comments, made clear that she was generally pretty supportive of Vice President Biden and more critical of the Trump foreign policy. Today, we're doing a different approach. Jim and I are not going to be here to necessarily praise or defend or criticize either of the two presidential candidates, but rather try to give more of an overview, our attempt at a more objective analysis of what the election of either Joe Biden or the re-election of Donald Trump might mean for American foreign and defense policy. You know, part of the Clements Center's mission is to present a broad range of views, and so we will certainly, have in the past and in the future, we'll welcome speakers with more partisan commitments or advocating more strongly for or against a particular position or candidate. But at times, we try to take a more, analytic and dispassionate approach, and that's what we're going to try to model today. I won't deny that Jim and I may have our own personal opinions on things, and we will certainly be voting, although we're not going to tell you what way we're going to be voting, but we're setting aside any of that today and just want to provide more of a scholarly perspective. A couple of disclaimers. We are not making any political predictions today in terms of we're not going to make any predictions about the polls or who might win the race or what might happen on election day. Rather, we're just going to be looking at the policy questions of what a second Trump term or a Biden presidency might mean. By way of introduction, most of you are familiar with me and Jim. You can read our full bios on the website. What gives us any sort of credibility to speak to these issues today? Well, a couple things. In addition to our role as scholars of American foreign and defense policy, Jim and I are, you might say, both recovering practitioners. But between the two of us, we have worked for 3 different presidencies of both parties in the White House, as well as in other national security roles. Jim, 20 years with the Army, but including some diplomatic assignments over in Europe, and me with past experience with Capitol Hill. And I've also worked in different roles with several presidential campaigns. And so that is going to be informing our take today. I'm going to start by giving a few minutes of some framing comments. We might consider a few principles for how do we even approach this question of what a presidential election or a new president or a presidential second term can mean for foreign policy. Jim will then share some observations from his time, his experience having worked under Vice President Biden and then under President Trump and Vice President Pence. So he'll share some operational, organizational observations. And then we'll get into the issues, and we'll just have a back and forth conversation between me and Jim over areas where we think there might be substantial differences between the two potential presidencies and areas where there might be some continuities. let me lay out 4 principles on how we should be thinking about this question of, do presidential elections matter, especially if it's between a potential second term or a new president. First principle is presidencies can often surprise and defy predictions. A president may sound one way on the campaign trail or have, taken a particular stance or persona as a candidate or in previous jobs, and then once in office can be fairly different. The classic example, of course, on this is President Nixon going to China, right? Nixon had made so much of his identity as previously as vice president, as candidate on a very strong anti-communist stance. China was seen by and large as an American adversary at the time, but Nixon then surprises much of the world and much of his own country by going to China in 1972 and really creating the major strategic opening there. Another one, based on my own current research and the book I'm writing on Ronald Reagan and the history of Reagan administration foreign policy, is Reagan was overall a hardliner, believed in a very substantial American buildup, a military buildup, and a very assertive confrontational posture towards the Soviet Union. But he also had a vision for abolishing all nuclear weapons. And many people were very surprised when in 1987, he and Mikhail Gorbachev signed the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty, which banned an entire category of nuclear weapons that had never before happened in the nuclear age. So Reagan, again, surprised people there. More recently, comparing Barack Obama as a senator and presidential candidate with his time in office, he surprised a number of people with his, as president, a much stronger, more assertive counterterrorism policy, especially the drone strikes, the Bin Laden raid, keeping Guantanamo Bay open. Again, very different from what we had thought we were going to see on the campaign trail. Which brings me to the second principle. Events intrude. And again, this is almost self-evident, but it bears reminding. And this also ties into how and why the first principle of how presidents can surprise and defy predictions. We'll go back a little bit further in history. The 1916 presidential election, when incumbent Woodrow Wilson was running for re-election, and his major platform in 1916 was, "I kept America out of the war." World War I had been raging for 2.5 years in Europe at the time, and Wilson, in line with a lot of American popular opinion, had kept America out of the war, and that was his plan for re-election. "I will continue to keep us out of the war." And then just a few months later, after being sworn in, partly because of events, Germany opens up unrestricted submarine warfare on American shipping, and Wilson then reverses and takes America into the war in February of 1917. More recent one, Jimmy Carter had come into office planning on a somewhat more conciliatory approach towards the Soviet Union, looking to cut some arms control deals, lower the tensions between the United States and the Soviets. But after the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in 1979, he then reverses course, does a major defense buildup, launches the covert action to support the Mujahideen against the Soviets. So again, events. Or one for the president I worked for, George W. Bush. Ran for office in 2000, promising a, quote, a more humble foreign policy, saying we're not going to do any nation building. Then 9/11 happens, and the Bush presidency turned out very differently. Third point or principle, building on the first two. Sometimes a presidential candidate, a challenger, will criticize the incumbent's policies, but then turn around and benefit from those policies once in office. I'll give you a couple examples, again, from the Reagan administration. While as a presidential candidate in the late 1970s, getting ready to challenge Jimmy Carter, then Governor Ronald Reagan was very critical of Carter's Panama Canal treaties, where Carter was going to return the Panama Canal to Panamanian control and sovereignty rather than being an American possession. Reagan was very critical of that. But Carter followed through on it. The Senate ratified it. And then once in office, Reagan didn't try to reverse that at all, and he actually benefited from it and found that Carter's decision helped in some ways to improve U.S. relations with Latin America. A similar example is in 1979 when Carter ended American diplomatic recognition of Taiwan and shifted diplomatic recognition over to China, to mainland China, to communist China, to Beijing, whatever you want to call it. Again, candidate Reagan was very critical of that. He thought it was a betrayal of Taiwan. However, once he became president, he didn't reverse the decision, and he ended up building a pretty strong partnership with China based largely on our shared interest in countering the Soviet Union. He didn't sell out Taiwan either. He maintained the arms sales to Taiwan, but he found that he actually benefited from that Carter policy that he had previously criticized. So bear that in mind as we watch, Joe Biden as the challenger, potentially criticizing some Trump policies. If Biden does win, that doesn't necessarily mean he will reverse all those policies. I'll just toss a couple out there. If Biden does win, I don't think, and he's pretty much said as much, that he will not reverse the American embassy in Israel decision. He won't move the embassy from Jerusalem back to Tel Aviv. Biden was somewhat critical of the operation that killed Iranian IRGC leader Qasem Soleimani, but at the same time, if he becomes president, he would benefit from that in some ways, I think. Likewise, the Trump decision to withdraw from the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty, Biden was somewhat critical of that, but he might actually benefit from that if he does become president, particularly if the United States needs to start redeveloping intermediate-range nuclear missiles to deploy in Asia as part of our growing tensions with China. Just speculating a little bit here. Then finally, the last principle before I turn it over to Jim. Over time, looking at the broader sweep of history, let's say the last 75, 100 years of American foreign policy, I think you see on the big picture more continuity than change in American foreign policy based on certain structures and principles. So the presidency certainly matters. Presidents can have a lot of influence on foreign policy, but they also inherit a set of structures, they inherit a set of principles, they inherit a set of traditions. Just a few of those I'll mention. First, it's been the American goal over the last 75 years to maintain some amount of primacy in the international system and to deter peer competitors. We don't like other countries becoming as powerful as us and trying to challenge us, whether it was the Soviet Union or now China. Another is generally an American commitment to preserving an open maritime order. We like the sea lanes to be free. We like trade to be able to travel free of piracy or free of control by another hostile power. Another is generally American strategy has been predicated on preventing the domination of key regions, particularly either the Middle East or the Eurasian landmass, by a hostile power. We think that if one hostile country dominates one of those regions, it's not good for American foreign policy. It's not good for the world. And generally, you see an American commitment to, by and large, encouraging the growth of free market democracies around the world, sometimes with more emphasis, sometimes with less, but that's generally a bias or a hardwired principle in American foreign policy. And so those sort of things are not easily changed by individual presidents. They're hardwired into our strategic culture and our national security institutions. So those are my little aphorisms, my 4 aphorisms to guide our thinking about how much does the presidency really matter. It matters a lot, but maybe not quite as much as we think it does when it comes to foreign policy. Now I'm going to turn it over to my friend and colleague, Jim Golby, who is going to talk to us about the similarities and differences he observed in the Obama-Biden administration and in the Trump administration. Jim?
Great. Thanks, Will. I'm really looking forward to being part of this conversation. I thought those were really insightful comments. As Will pointed out, I spent about the last 13 months of the Obama-Biden administration working as a senior advisor to Vice President Biden. And then I worked for about the first 6 months in the same role for Vice President Pence. So I had a unique opportunity, I think, to see at a very high level of government policymaking the differences between the two leaders and the two administrations. And so today I'm actually going to pick up and challenge Will's fourth point just a little bit. While I agree broadly that there are a lot of continuities and that there are many things that make America's policies stable over time, I'm going to argue that process, personality, and partisan polarization might lead us to see some bigger discontinuities overall than we may have seen throughout history. And so the first thing I'll talk about is the process. And this is the process of the national security apparatus at the White House, which the president does have quite a bit of influence and ability to shape. And I think Vice President Biden, if elected, and President Trump, if in a second term, would both structure these very differently. So Vice President Biden would probably have a much more formal and interagency approach, whereas President Trump would be much more likely to continue his ad hoc and lead agency approach. So let me talk a little bit about those differences. First, with the sort of formal interagency process, which was common under the Obama administration, we've seen it at other points throughout our history, arguably first with President Eisenhower, you saw more of a structured approach where all of the different actors have seats at the table, not just at the National Security Council meetings that are attended by the president, but also at a set of meetings that go down to lower levels, both from cabinet officials to deputies, and then down to working level officials like I was. And so at each of these different points, you have an opportunity throughout this process to bring different ideas, different options to represent the interests of your bureaucratic agency or department or your office. And it leads to sort of a more deliberate process where you consider all options, you get more ideas out on the table, you take more time to try to integrate plans carefully, you try to identify any potential unintended consequences as a way to try to mitigate some of these effects. Now, there's some real strengths to this process. First, you can mitigate some of these unintended consequences. You can try to anticipate things. You can work very hard on coordination. To some degree, you save the principal's or the president's time by trying to get him more fully developed and integrated options for him to consider. But from the president's standpoint, there are also some drawbacks. First, there are a lot of veto points that each of the different bureaucratic agencies have, and it can lead them to have a lot of control over which options come up to the president, and in some ways make the president feel very constrained. Second, it can also be somewhat a slow process. So if you're trying to deal with situations rapidly or make big, bold changes, in many cases, this very structure, this deliberation, this process can make the types of decisions that President Trump has made with the killing of Qasem Soleimani, for example, much more difficult to carry out quickly. And then the third thing I would point to as sort of a potential downside is that as you're going through these deliberations, at least my experience was that there were times where individual policymakers could begin to believe that they could simply thread the needle, that by looking at all these different competing perspectives, that if you could just get that right integration, that you'd be able to control events more than you probably can in practice. And so there are a lot of strengths to this approach. It's very deliberate, very process-oriented, and does set up a good system for the president, but it can be slow and it can be constraining. I think what we've seen from President Trump has been a much more ad hoc personal approach and a lead agency approach, which I'll talk about a little bit in a minute. So one of the things that the Trump administration did, and I saw this across several national security advisors, and from what I can tell, it's still in place, is that they drastically reduced the number of interagency meetings sort of at all levels. They were convinced that principals were spending too much time engaged in these discussions and not enough time leading their departments or organizations. And so we started to see a lot more of what we called paper principals committee meetings, which essentially was...
Jim, part of my interruption here, can you just explain to our viewers what you mean by interagency? It's a term of art used in Washington law, but to make sure everyone knows, yeah.
Great. So interagency, usually what we think of are the different departments and agencies. So the Department of State, the Department of the Treasury, Department of Defense, the Joint Staff, the Department of Justice, all these different organizations, the CIA, that come together and usually meet in the Situation Room and try to coordinate across each other at the sort of National Security Council staff. And then there are iterative levels, as I said before, going down where these same meetings take place across. When the Trump administration came in, they got rid of a lot of these meetings, and they started handling some problems by what they would call these paper meetings, where someone on the National Security Council staff or at one of the agencies would frame a problem, they'd lay out the pros and cons, and then they would send it out for consultation in a written form. And then each of the departments would have their chance to weigh in a written form without having to go to a meeting. That streamlined things a lot, but it also eliminates some of the back and forth that you might have as arguments come into conflict with each other when you're in a meeting room. It can lead to some blind spots that someone might miss, but it can help you act aggressively, boldly, quickly. And one of the things that the president in particular seemed to like to do was have these smaller meetings of trusted advisors where he would, instead of bringing in the entire National Security Council and all of their staff with a room full of sometimes dozens of people, he'd pull together his key trusted advisors, the White House Chief of Staff, the National Security Advisor, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, etc. So a much smaller group, and they would discuss these issues in a much more sort of collegial, back and forth way, as a way that he found allowed him to engage the issues and, to some degree, to get past a lot of the veto points that he saw were constraining him in office. And so I think this does lead to some discontinuity simply by seeing a different structure that we're going to see in place. The second thing that I want to talk about is personality. And there are some ways in which President Trump and President Biden share some personality characteristics. I think one is that they both really do believe in the value of personal diplomacy. I think it's for slightly different reasons. President Trump believes that he's a great negotiator and can get in a small room and persuade people. He also thinks he can use, tweets and public messaging in a very populist way to shape public opinion. There's a lot of evidence that that's true. I think Vice President Biden believes in sort of this personal diplomacy for a little bit different reason. And part of it is because he's developed relationships over decades on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, where he came into contact with a lot of leaders there that he, now are in power today. He did the same thing for 8 years as vice president, where he took on some of these personal diplomatic roles that were tasked to him by President Obama. And then I think he also has seen, sort of the value of the State Department over this longer career in the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, where he not only believes in his personal relationships, but believes in those relationships more broadly. And I think two things that we should probably expect to draw from this are, one, we probably will see a little bit more deliberate public messaging from a Biden administration than we would from a Trump administration, and more focus again on this private relationship-based diplomacy. Whereas with the Trump administration, we've seen a lot of this over the past few years, where the president uses tweets, he uses public statements as ways to try to change course very quickly. And in some cases, this not only is used for diplomacy, but also internal negotiations within his own administration. By tweeting something out that isn't quite in order, he can force a response from some of the agencies to respond to his demands in a way that could be very hard if he had to do it privately through the domestic processes. So that's two things. And I think we'll see discontinuity in both places. And then the last one is the impacts of partisan polarization. And this isn't just about the fundamental disagreements we have, but the way it constrains administrations. So it's much easier for presidents today to make some agreements through executive agreement than they probably had done historically. But it's very difficult for them to get treaties through the Senate. It's very difficult for them to get broad bipartisan support for the courses they want to take in foreign policy. And that's one of the reasons you could see, President Obama establish the nuclear deal with Iran and the JCPOA, but then President Trump very quickly in his administration overturn it. So on the first hand, it's easy to make these agreements, harder to get rid of them. I think second, though, it means that our allies and partners probably recognize this a little bit more and might hedge their positions more than they would in the past. So if Vice President Biden has said that one of his first messages is going to be that America is back and we're with our allies and partners, the question we have to ask is whether or not our allies and partners can fully believe that his approach will be different than President Trump's approach, and whether or not they can count on that lasting if Vice President Biden were to lose a subsequent election. And then the other place I would say it comes up is in dealing with new crises. So there is a lot of continuity and problems that we faced in the past. But if we go back to September 11th, 2001, and we look at the development over the next few years, and we do the thought experiment of what would that have looked like with a President Gore instead of a President Bush, we very likely would have seen a military response under each scenario. But the particulars and the details of the policy and how those rolled out, I think could in fact be quite different. And so I think those three factors mean that there is a chance that a president has more ability to shape foreign policy than they probably have in quite some time. But it also might not be as durable or lasting a changes as some previous presidents made as well.
Yeah, there's an interesting paradox to explore there. Any political science PhD students who are watching looking for a dissertation topic, there's one for you. So, all right, Jim, well, very helpful. How about let's dive into the issues now. Let's just kind of go through a number of the front burner issues facing the United States and talk talk about whether we think a Trump or Biden presidency would be more similar or more different. Let's start with great power stuff first. I'll share a couple thoughts on China, and then you may want to add to those, and then let's have you address Russia as well. Okay, so China. Let me put out my first provocation. I think on the big picture, on the strategic goals, on the policy priorities, I think a second Trump term or a Biden presidency will be much more similar than different on China. What you've got going on with the U.S.-China relationship, and we've had some other good speakers address this, but if over the last 30 years or so, the broad strategic consensus on U.S.-China relations was for the U.S. to engage China, to try to encourage internal political and economic reform, to hope that as China becomes a more deeply intertwined trading partner with us and a more active member of the international community, that China would also become more peaceful, more stable, a better international partner abroad, and would treat its people better at home. Over the last few years, and this really started in the last couple of years of the Obama administration, that strategic consensus has been almost completely blown up. It's largely been blown up by, I would say, by China's actions and China's direction. One can point to perhaps some American policy missteps too, but this is largely a function of the Chinese Communist Party has determined that it wants to go in a different direction, especially under Xi Jinping, and now becoming ruler for life, and be very focused on maintaining the Chinese Communist Party's monopoly on power. And so the Trump administration, of course, has pursued a much more confrontational approach towards China, whether it's on trade or the military dimension or diplomatic dimension. I think a lot of the main features of that would continue if Biden were elected president. I think you would continue to see this economic decoupling, maybe not completely, but certainly in that general direction. I think a President Biden would probably maintain most of the more punitive economic measures that Trump has put on China. I think a President Biden, as would a second Trump term, I should say, I think a President Biden would also continue our recalibrating our military posture in the Western Pacific to more directly address China's growing assertiveness there. So I think in the main, you'd see more continuity than change under either of them on China. The differences we'd see on China would be more a matter of means. I do think a Biden presidency would focus more on working with America's allies in the Asia Pacific, and certainly our alliance structure is one of our great strengths there. Historic alliances with Japan, with South Korea, with Australia, with the Philippines, with Thailand, less remembered. Those have not fared so well under a Trump presidency, but I think a Biden presidency would see those as very important for an overall strategy towards China. You would probably see a Biden presidency focus a little bit more on human rights in China as well. Now, some Trump administration officials, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, Ambassador at Large for Religious Freedom Sam Brownback, have actually spoken out quite a bit on China's repression of the Uyghur Muslims in Xinjiang, squelching democracy activists, some of the crackdown, really the extinguishing of democracy in Hong Kong. But that does not seem to have been as much of a priority for President Trump himself. And in a hierarchical, autocratic, top-down system like China, Xi Jinping is going to pay the most attention to what the American president is saying. So I think you would probably see a little bit more of a human rights and democracy focus under a Biden presidency. All right, Jim, over to you. Let's hear your thoughts on that, and maybe then pivot to Russia too.
Yeah, Will, I tend to agree largely with your assessment of policy towards China. I think there will be quite a bit of continuity. I think Chinese actions, in particular, have actually helped draw allies to the U.S. side, and we've seen with a few examples. The Japan-South Korea relationship has probably worsened over the last few years. But with Australia, with Japan, there are a number of places where Chinese assertiveness is driving some of the allies away from them rather than to them. And I think that sort of plays to a fundamental structural change in the region. I would say to point out a few places in addition to those you said where we might see some differences. I also think that we would probably see differences on climate change and cooperation on COVID. Whereas I think Vice President Biden will probably, if elected, take an attempt to push back and continue to be tough on China I think he will also try to bracket off a few places where he thinks that cooperation is essential or necessary. I think the other place that might be interesting to look at is there might be a slight change in terms of the sort of mercantilist versus defense priorities. So you've seen this already coming out a little bit with Michelle Flournoy, who is a potential Secretary of Defense under a Biden administration, making some comments about the need to increase deterrence posture and messages in Taiwan. Again, there's some similarity there with the Trump administration. But again, I think the Trump administration brings the economic component into all these discussions, whereas I think it'd be a little bit more clear with the Biden administration to be focused more on the question of democratic promotion and security. So I think there's a change there. On the question of Russia, I think the public posture will definitely look significantly different. I think we've seen President Trump reluctant to criticize Vladimir Putin in a number of instances where at least it appears that the U.S. government has suspected the Russian government of wrongdoing. And one of those cases is with the alleged bounty program in Afghanistan. I think we'll very clearly see a change in sort of the diplomatic public pushback and posture there, and I think that'll be unmistakable and very noticeable from early on. In terms of the military posture towards Russia, though, I think there will be some ways in which there will actually be a lot of continuity following the Russian attack into eastern Ukraine and Crimea in 2014. We've actually seen the United States, along with NATO partners, allies and partners, significantly build up its deterrent posture in Eastern Europe. And I think we'll continue to see a strong deterrent stance. But one place where there will be a significant change is on the question of the role of nuclear weapons and arms control. And I think a Biden administration is likely, first of all, to extend the New START treaty without condition, which the Trump administration has been threatening not to do. Second, it will look to
give our viewers a real quick 30 seconds on New START.
Yeah, so New START was an agreement reached in 2010 between the United States and Russia to cap the level of strategic nuclear weapons, so the weapons that can launch and really launch from Russia to the United States or vice versa, put caps on deployability, on the number of warheads, on the total number of warheads. It also put in some verification regimes that allow us to know more about what the Russians are doing and for them to know more about what we're doing. Now, there are some weaknesses in this, in that Russia developed a few systems that are outside of nuclear systems that are outside of the treaty's parameters, and there are concerns about that. But for the most part, it allows us to have a good view of what Russia is doing, and it gives us some reasonable assurance on this vital question of strategic nuclear weapons. And it's one of the few areas where we really haven't seen much Russian cheating or violations, I think because they believe it's in their interest as well to keep sort of that strategic competition under control. But we could see Vice President Biden push even harder to get lower levels of nuclear weapons. We will probably start to hear discussions about ways to reduce the role of nuclear weapons in U.S. foreign policy as we turn to other conventional means. And we'll probably start to hear discussions of things like the no first use policy of nuclear weapons, which I think is something that a Biden administration would probably consider as part of its first nuclear posture review.
Interestingly, bringing this back around to our China discussion, especially as China seems to potentially be moving away from a no first use policy to a launch on warning policy. But for our nuclear weapons specialists out there are watching that carefully for us. But again, to step back for a second, this shows how foreign policy can be so complicated, right? Because and how presidencies are complicated. Because Jim and I think both agree that at the highest level, a Biden presidency would take a overall very different approach to Russia than President Trump has. Biden certainly wouldn't have nice things to say about Putin and be pretty skeptical there. A Biden presidency might be more assertive or even retaliatory towards Russian active measures and election meddling has been doing. On the other hand, a Biden presidency would potentially be more cooperative with Russia on something like extending the New START treaty. the Trump administration has been sending some mixed signals on that, but certainly has not come out and said explicitly that they would. And so this is where it can be hard to make generalizations. Some differences between the two, potentially some similarities. Jim, since you mentioned Afghanistan and a Biden presidency potentially taking a much stronger stance against the reported bounties on American troops that Russian intelligence was sponsoring in Afghanistan, let's talk a little bit about Afghanistan. And do we think a Biden presidency or a second Trump term would pursue very different goals there? I'll just toss out briefly. I think they would probably be more similar than different. President Biden has for some time been pretty skeptical about the American mission in Afghanistan, if you will. And he was certainly an opponent of President Obama's Afghanistan surge 11 years ago. And I think is probably tired of our presence there. And we certainly see that President Trump has been wanting to get out of Afghanistan. But do you think I'm wrong? Am I missing something here? There's certainly, certainly some nuances to this.
No, I actually think it's probably the policy on which we might see the most continuity. I think both have the same goals in Afghanistan. Vice President Biden has probably been slightly more vocal about wanting to leave a counterterrorism presence, which could be a sticking point in any potential deal between the Afghan government and the Taliban. But as we know now, there's peace discussions going on between the Taliban and the Afghan government, and those have been brought together by Ambassador Zalmay Khalilzad, who's the special representative for Afghanistan and Pakistan in the U.S. government. The Biden administration has signaled that they might be willing to keep him on if there is not an agreement reached by the end of the administration. So I actually think we could see a lot of similarity between the way the two presidents would approach the problem there.
Yeah, potentially not just continuity in policy, but even continuity in personnel if they keep Zal on. Yeah, and we were honored to have him here as a guest speaker on campus a few years ago. So, all right, Jim, let's spin the globe just a tiny bit from Afghanistan. Look a little bit further west to Iran. Do we think there would be more similarities and more differences between a Trump or Biden administration on Iran? I'll go first, put it out there. Would love to hear your reactions. I think we might see fairly substantial differences in policy towards Iran. Obviously, President Trump has been very hawkish towards Iran, withdrew from the nuclear deal, known more formally as the JCPOA. And of course, we talked about the strike to kill Soleimani. Trump has deepened ties with some of our traditional Sunni Arab partners there as part of this coalition against Iran. And of course, President Biden was vice president when the Obama administration concluded the JCPOA, and some of Biden's top advisors now, some of our friends, Colin Kahl, Jake Sullivan, were in different ways important architects of the Iran nuclear deal. So maybe Iran might be an area where we'd see more difference than similarity between the two. But what do you think?
Yeah, I agree. I actually think the Biden administration will probably try to do what it can, conditional on the Iranian regime stepping back from some of the nuclear activities that they've recently taken up with stockpiling some more low-enriched uranium and developing higher enriched uranium than they ever have before. Conditional on them doing that, I think a Biden administration would probably try to get back into the deal pretty quickly, but then would also go into trying to bring on other talks about Iranian missiles and Iranian proxies.
But I think support for terrorism.
But I think this is where we're likely to see even bigger changes in sort of the regional posture outside of just the nuclear question, because so much of the Trump approach, as you mentioned, was sort of doubling down on our traditional Gulf allies. And all of those Gulf allies are sort of cash strapped, at least more so than usual, due to COVID, due to the drop in oil prices. And I think it's actually going to be a difficult needle to thread to both convince them that President Biden would be tough enough on Iran to satisfy their desires and Israeli desires while still getting meaningful cooperation. And I think that was one of the problems that President Obama ran into toward the end of his administration as well. On the flip side, though, there are some growing concerns that this investment into, Saudi Arabia and Egypt have let gross human rights violations go. I think we'd see much more focus on that from Biden administration. I think we'll see Biden try to put pressure to end the war in Yemen and removing some of the support to the Saudis. And I actually think that we'll see sort of a rebalancing in the relationship with Egypt, which has become very militarily heavy focused in terms of our aid. So I think it's going to be a difficult needle to thread to prove that we want to be tough on Iran while still then I think reducing or increasing some of the conditionality that we have in terms of our support to the other allies in the region.
Very good points. A couple additional thoughts on Iran, again, just showing how complex these things are. If we see a Biden presidency, I actually think the Biden team would benefit in some ways from how Trump's more confrontational policies towards Iran, especially on the economic sanctions front, have really weakened Iran. And so Iran has a weaker hand now than they did back during the Obama administration. And so if Biden did want to pursue a more, ambitious, 2.0 version of the nuclear deal, he might find that he's got a stronger hand towards Tehran because of some of these Trump policies. On the other hand, I'm comfortable saying one of the weaknesses or deficiencies or downsides in the Trump approach to Iran has been how it is, we've lost our most important European partners on this, especially the British and the Germans and the French, who have been, historically key economic trading partners with Iran. And if there is a second Trump term, as Trump is looking for where he would want to go with his policy on Iran, I think he would certainly need to do some work repairing those partnerships with the Europeans, because any solution to the Iran challenge is it's going to need to involve them as well. Conversely, if we have a Biden presidency, I think that would probably be a focus of Biden's efforts, is bringing the Europeans back alongside or back into the equation as partners on whatever the American policy towards Iran is.
I would agree and disagree on 2 points there. One has to do with the Iranian position, which I think has changed, but I'm not sure I'd categorize it overall as a weakness, but it's less an absolute question than a relative. As I mentioned before, Iran has managed to maintain conflicts in Yemen and Syria. They've increased their influence in Iraq. And so I think there are ways in which, their very cheap use of proxy forces, despite the death of Qasem Soleimani, has put them in a position that is arguably better than it was at the start of the administration, simply because Saudi Arabia and the Emiratis in particular haven't been able to counter this, relatively cheap use of forces. On the other hand, I do think you're right that from a bargaining standpoint, Iran is in a weaker position, both because of their economic pain that they'll suffer, as well as, President Biden could go in and say, look, my hands are tied. I've got to get a better deal than we had before. Otherwise, I just can't sell this domestically. And so I think, he probably has a little bit of leverage with European partners who will want to cooperate, that he could, push for a little bit more on top of a deal or follow on talks on missiles and proxy forces and those types of things. So I think the landscape has shifted, but I'm not sure we can, clearly say it's, better or worse. It's just different than it looked 4 years ago.
North Korea. This is a tough one for me to predict. It seems like overall the U.S.-North Korea relations are at somewhat of an impasse where, for quite a while, different presidencies tried, pressure, then tried multilateral negotiations with the six-party talks. Then, of course, Trump, brought out a new gambit in the toolkit with his two summit meetings with Kim Jong-un, which generated a lot of attention, but seemed to have generated no progress whatsoever on North Korea reining in its bad behavior or reining in its nuclear weapons program. So I'm not quite sure what to predict there. I think the Biden team, if he were to win, sees that the Trump approach hasn't necessarily worked, but I don't know that they necessarily have a much better. They might try something different, maybe going back to more pressure again, maybe trying to bring our regional allies on a little bit more. I do know that Japan was very concerned about Trump's outreach to North Korea, whereas the current South Korean government really applauded it. So it's kind of a mixed bag with allies there. And if there's a second Trump term, I don't know whether he will try to re-engage with North Korea, or wash his hands of it, saying that didn't work and it's time to go back to more pressure. So I know you have any thoughts there?
Yeah, I tend to agree. I think one thing you can say is this is probably an area where, regardless of administration, our policies haven't been very effective over the last few decades, and North Korea's hand continues to get stronger. I know one difference. Vice President Biden has said publicly that he wouldn't go to the table without some conditions being met. He hasn't been clear about what those conditions are. But in terms of the goals, he's also said that he would pursue denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula as well. So I think a little bit more multilateral.
Which every American president has wanted going back.
Yeah, but I do think one of the challenges with this is that if at some point, and they're probably getting closer, if North Korea is actually at a point where they could potentially threaten Hawaii or the U.S. homeland with a nuclear weapon, then whatever president faces that, if they haven't solved the problem by then, has a much tougher decision to make, because if they trade away, some nuclear deterrent that's only regional based and that can't touch the U.S., you're going to have some very disappointed allies while protecting U.S. interests. And so I think it's going to continue to be a thorn in the United States side. And I haven't seen any stark policy changes, regardless of who's going to get elected, that make it clear we're going to see a shift in direction.
Yeah, well, Jim, you and I don't pretend to be North Korea experts, but shameless plug here for our viewers. Next week on October 6th, we are going to hear from two of the world's leading North Korea experts, who both happen to be with us here at UT, General Vince Brooks and Dr. Sheena Wright. So look for an announcement of that.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Horns of a Dilemma, and please don't forget to visit our website at tnsr.org.